He was powerful, they said, and wise. His words were profound and his hands full of healing. That was the rumor. So when he came down from that mountain and began to speak, he was met by a large crowd. They had come in search of healing or wisdom or both. But when he spoke, he said everything backwards. Blessed are the poor, blessed are the hungry. Well, it didn't feel like such a blessing, did it, standing there ready to faint from hunger while this guy talked and talked about how blessed they were. And woe to the rich and well-fed? Yeah, how very woeful it must be to have your belly ache from overindulgence. Certainly, some of the poor and most of the rich probably tuned him out as he spoke about the world in upside-down terms. Did he really not understand how things worked, or was he just nuts? But some were listening. He could see it in their eyes as they began to understand his vision of a world that was turned upside down in the best possible way. What if the poor could be blessed? What if people could stand together on the same level, no one better off than others? These were words of hope, awakening something in the hearts of those who had not yet succumbed to despair. They were listening, maybe even leaning forward to hear more. And so Jesus continued for them. But I say to you that listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you, and if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them again. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. But love your enemies, do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be the children of the Most High, for God is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For the measure you give will be the measure you get back. I imagine these words were as challenging then as they are now. Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, turn the other cheek, lend to people who will never be able to pay you back, and do not judge people. Forgive. These are easy things to say, and those of us who have grown up in churches have grown up hearing them. As soon as I started reading, you might have known what was coming. We know these words, and we know how hard they are. Seriously, love your enemies, do good to people who hate you, and turn the other cheek. Isn't that just enabling bad behavior? Then the money part. Give to people who beg and lend to people who won't pay back. That's bad financial advice. And again, enabling. Then there's that part about judgment. You're not allowed to judge people even if they're terrible people. Isn't that kind of naive? And isn't it necessary to condemn people for, say, being criminals? It's almost like Jesus doesn't understand the legal system. Or maybe that kind of thing would have worked 2,000 years ago, but now? Maybe it's just a bit outdated, this sermon on the plain. So we have a choice. We could file it away in the folder called Famous but Antiquated Teachings of Jesus for informational purposes only, or we could put this teaching from Luke into practice. That is what Father Gregory Boyle did. Have you heard of him? Father Greg is a Jesuit priest, and in 1986, fresh out of seminary, he was given his first appointment in the most gang-influenced neighborhood of LA. Some would call it dangerous, and it was. Every other block was controlled by a different gang. In just a few months, he'd performed scores of funerals for gang members. Another priest might have locked himself inside the church and waited for the next grieving family to schedule the funeral, but Father Greg didn't do that. Instead, he hopped onto his bike and began riding through the neighborhoods. He didn't want to wait for more gangsters to show up in caskets. He wanted to meet them while they were still alive. Over time, Father Greg built relationships with these young men, and he also earned their trust and respect, and they earned his. Judgment was replaced by empathy as he began to understand that they were not in gangs because they enjoyed lawlessness and violence. They were in gangs because they didn't see any other way to survive. Father Greg says now gang violence is about a lethal absence of hope. He wondered what if he could help these men to have hope. And that's how his ministry began. He started a bakery and he hired gang members who wanted a new way of life. People thought he was crazy, hiring gangbangers. They had rap sheets and face tattoos. They were convicts and felons. They were, to many people's thinking, enemies. But Father Greg showed these people love and goodness because he took a radical Jesus-style approach. Instead of seeing them as hateful enemies, he saw them as hurting children of God who needed love. They had slapped more than a few cheeks in their time, done acts of great hatred and violence, yet Father Greg took a chance on them, investing in a better future. There was no question of being paid back. The whole thing could fail, and people assured him that it would fail. But Father Greg, following Jesus' instructions to the T, withheld judgment and condemnation and became merciful, just as God is merciful. He describes it in less churchy language. He said, "We work with the population no one wants to work with, and it's a principle of this place that we stand with them." He's invested 3 decades of his life into standing with those that nobody desires to work with. Against all possible odds, the ministry, called Homeboy Industries, quickly grew beyond a bakery. It expanded to include screen printing, janitorial services, and more. Services to help ex-gang members include tattoo removal, educational support, and substance abuse counseling. Thousands of humans have been rehabilitated and given tools to build a better life outside of the gang. You might even say that together they are helping to build the kingdom of God, bringing it forth right there in that least likely of places. But then again, the kingdom of God usually does show up where we least expect it to. I think if Father Gregory had been present that day when Jesus gave his sermon on the plain, Jesus might have pointed to him and used that ministry as an example. For Jesus started that sermon by seeing the poor, the hungry, the despairing, the hated, and calling them blessed, not cursed. He saw their potential and then called upon the wealthy to be mindful of them. The whole thing is a setup for his instructions on how to live in the kingdom of God, how to live as disciples, by loving the ones called enemies, by doing good to those who haven't experienced enough goodness to know how it works, by giving generously to anyone in need with no expectation of being repaid, by withholding judgment and offering in its place mercy. That's our calling too. And I would point at Father Gregory's story to say, look, if this guy can extend radical love to people who likely is not would have stolen his bike to sell, what about us? Who is in need of our mercy and compassion? And I don't mean to suggest the only way of living this out is to start a bakery and staff it with gang members. What I do mean to suggest is this. If one person's grace can have such an impact upon so many, then what is stopping any of us from offering our own measure of grace into the places we can reach? And I'm really talking small scale here, remembering that Jesus was just as concerned about one lost sheep as the whole flock. It's because of Jesus' own insistence that I invite you to think of just one person who may have done you wrong, someone you find hard to like, much less love. And I want to ask you, have you forgiven that person? Which is not the same as forgetting the injury. Amnesia is not required for forgiveness. What is required is to let go of the need for revenge, to stop cursing and start blessing, praying for wholeness and healing for that person, seeing them as worthy of that. Because let me tell you this, in the ancient world, turning the other cheek was not an invitation for the aggressor to hit you again. It was a way of asking him to look you in the eye, to see you as an equal, and for you to do the same. To stop the cycle of hatred and aggression, people must be able to look at one another and see, here's another child of God, no more worthy or unworthy of God's mercy than I, yet to both of us it's given. And so we are called to be merciful, just as our God is merciful. What do people need? Maybe it's food, clothing, a warm blanket. These are things that can be given, but humans also need to be loved and accepted, to be seen and heard and valued. These are also gifts we can give, and I just heard Jesus telling us that he expects his disciples to give without expecting anything in return. You know what that means? That person who is simply impossible for you to get along with? Yes, and you also give that person your respect and regard, even if you won't get that back in return. Jesus calls us to let go of our bitterness, our anger, our grudges, and replace it all with compassion. Learning to see people with empathy, we release them from the anger in which we may be holding them, and in doing so, we become merciful, like God is merciful. Now let's be clear on one thing. Jesus is not telling us to stay in toxic relationships. No one is meant to suffer abuse. ever. That is not the will of God for people to harm one another or endure harm. It's important to know when the line has been crossed and, if necessary, to remove ourselves from situations of harm. But we must eventually move into a place of compassion as we learn to pray for the healing of the other, replacing anger with compassion as we seek to forgive. Holding on to hatred, it means we're shackled to an unhealthy relationship. Freedom means being free to love as God does, with mercy and compassion, recognizing everyone's potential to receive blessing. It's unusual, but Jesus didn't claim to be an ordinary person. His life wasn't ordinary, nor was his death, nor was his love. The love he gave was boundless, given in all the wrong places to all the weirdest people, so that even we, thousands of years later, might still feel a measure of that love, a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. That's the love we are given. May this also be the kind of love we give.